I've also got, I'm going to be talking about a research project, and I'm working on it with Fran, who is online, and it looks like we have fixed all our problems with online. So we're going to hear from Fran a little bit. So I'm Jessica. I work at the University of London. I'm the programme director for the PG Cert Learning and Teaching in Higher Education. Fran is one of my students on the programme, but also working with me on a research project that we're undertaking at the moment about looking at generative AI and its effect on, yes, that's me, great, thank you, Stephen. So this project is something that's been funded by Code, so thank you very much for to Code for funding it. And okay, good, brilliant. Yeah, good, Stephen. So obviously we all know, we've seen kind of lots of information like this about students using AI. So I was very interested in this from the perspective of kind of not just my students, but also the people on my course all have their own students, because they're all people who are teaching or supporting learning in higher education. So it's kind of a hot topic for them. It's an interesting topic for me. But what I wanted to do was not so much kind of approach it from, you know, what are they using GenAI for, but approach it from the perspective of academic identities. So thinking about how students create academic identities through their writing, and how GenAI might affect that. So if they're using GenAI to support their writing, what impact does that have on their academic identity? So as I said, my course is a course in learning and teaching in higher education. So everyone on it has their own students in higher education. It's an online course, so we have people from all over the world on it. So a lot of context. And in my own programme, most of our assessments are written assessments. So we require people to do academic writing. So I thought this is a really interesting kind of group of people to research because they come to us already with an academic identity, because they have got a kind of disciplinary background of their own. You know, maybe they come teaching chemistry, so they have this academic identity as a chemist. So they've got that existing academic identity, but then they're also establishing, what is my academic identity in education? For most people, this is the first time that they've done writing in an education context. So how does that kind of shift their academic identity, that, you know, I'm not necessarily a historian anymore, I'm a historian plus now I'm writing in education. So that's a slightly different identity. And I think this identity shift is actually common to a lot of postgrad taught courses, because a lot of them are linked to professions. So it's kind of becoming that academic identity in a specific profession as well. And as well as them thinking about their own process of academic identities, they've also got the ability to reflect on their students. So I think it's like a really fascinating group of people to research. So Fran's working with me on this. As I said, she's a student, so she has got that kind of insider approach, because I didn't really want to ask people these questions in my position as programme director, because I think I get one set of answers, where I think Fran is going to get a lot more authentic responses, and hopefully not what people think I might want to hear about their academic identities and how they're using GenAI, especially with the use of GenAI, that might be something that, you know, is a little bit controversial and people are maybe uncomfortable with exploring exactly how they're using it. So hopefully having Fran as there as a barrier, and I'm only going to get the information anonymously, so I won't know, you know, which student has said what, and I'm not going to follow anything up with anyone. So that's been kind of a really useful part of the project. I have to do a spoiler alert here. We have no results yet, because we have had lots of problems, not anything to do with Fran, but lots of problems with kind of recruiting people, partly because this is a very bad time for us at the moment, because everyone is working towards assessments. So we're hoping that we're going to get over that hurdle. And we are kind of very shortly, Fran's going to be running the groups, and we're going to get some great analysis. But what I'm going to take you through is what we've been working on so far. Our literature review, what we've been looking at And Fran's also going to give you some of her reflections about her own experiences of academic writing and identity and how she uses generative AI. So coming to this idea about kind of academic identity, it's very much grounded in a lot of the kind of key writings, such as Lee and Street, who were writing about the fact, and when they published this, it was kind of very, you know, a new idea, a new way of looking at writing. Before that, people thought about writing in higher education as very kind of mechanical. We need to teach students that, you know, there's a structure, they need to do an introduction and a conclusion. They need to learn how to write in the correct grammar and format and stuff like this. Whereas Lee and Street and, you know, other people kind of came along and said, actually, writing is so closely tied to questions of identity. And actually, the writing process is about this construction of identity. And that's what we need to be discussing with our students. And actually, academic writing is really closely tied to power relations. Who has the ability to stand there and kind of speak with authority? Who has the ability to speak in a certain way in a particular discipline that they're going to be listened to? And part of that process of academic writing that our students do is that kind of, you know, unconsciously within whatever they're writing is, you know, I'm a person who knows about this. I'm a person who could be given credit for this. I'm a person who can pass this module because I'm writing in a certain way that you'll accept my knowledge. Ivanovich has also written about how it's not just about one identity in your writing, but it's negotiating the fact that you've got your own autobiographical identity, the things that you bring to your writing, and also that kind of authority that you're beginning to have within your discipline. But, you know, because of the time that all of this really interesting stuff is being written, it's very much not so much taking into context of technology in writing that we have now. So that we have people like Highland talking about that you construct your voice through the rhetorical choices that you make in how to write. But it's really interesting to think about, but if AI is doing some of that choice for us, how does that change things? Pittam has looked at academic identity in relation to plagiarism and how it's really helpful, and how if you really foreground these issues with students, it's actually kind of really protective of plagiarism, because they look at themselves, they look at their positionality within the writing in a different way. And I wonder if that might be similar for generative AI. If now we shift to kind of looking at writing as a kind of process of becoming, a process of identity making, and also in an online context, there's existing research about the importance of emotion in academic writing, the sense of, you know, it's maybe a process between gaining confidence, but there's a real vulnerability. There's a real kind of horrible moment when, you know, you're, as a student, you submit something and you pass it over for judgment ultimately. So, you know, you have to kind of take that vulnerable step. But it's hopefully a process of gaining confidence. It's this process of, do I have legitimacy as a student in this subject? And there's been some interesting research about in the context of legal identities and how that's established through writing. And also Amanda French has done, she did a whole kind of PhD project, and she's also published from it, about people working in higher education and about how we establish our academic identities. Particularly in the context of online and distance learning, there's some interesting stuff around belonging and how we get that sense of belonging. And some of that is through academic success linked to our success in our writing. And then again, feeling like, you know, we are a legitimate student. We are part of this discipline now. And there's also some interesting research around the importance of peers to shape identities, to develop confidence, and also to, you know, peers kind of working with each other to kind of work out, you know, who do we need to be in our writing? Who do we need to be in this academic context? And I think in online and distance education, particularly perhaps online education, writing is really important. It's, we're moving towards lots of other mediums, but, even using all this technology, it's the chatbots discussing and writing, different ideas. We all have, if we work on online courses, we probably all have discussion forums, and, we're expecting students to do a lot of discussion through writing. So I think focusing on it is a really key area for online education. But I think actually often in online and distance education, we maybe have less support around writing, or maybe it's quite different. If particularly in the UK now, I think we've moved to a place where if you are a face-to-face student, there's often a learning development department, and you can often go down and sit down with someone and discuss your writing practices. But in online learning, we often have great resources in it. University of London, we do have really great resources around writing, but they're kind of, they're not so dialogic. And if we do have that dialogic support, often it's companies like Studiosity, who then don't necessarily know, the actual institutional context, the program context, maybe, as well as if we have learning developers who are working within the university and working with programs as well. We also have really interesting developments, like, I don't know how many of you saw Einstein AI that came out a couple of weeks ago, and I was very confidently saying, if you've got a course on Canvas, pay us some money, we'll post on the discussion forums for you, we'll kind of do everything, and then we'll write your assessment for you. So we'll be, and then it kind of made me think, in the future on my course, am I just going to have lots of AI talking to lots of AI, and maybe that will really regenerate my discussion forums. At the end of the module, they're not very well populated. I'll notice it, because I'll be like, wow, suddenly there's hundreds and hundreds of posts. But obviously, what is anybody learning if it's just lots of AI? So there's kind of lots of interesting issues. And then kind of thinking particularly about GenAI, there is literature around this. It's obviously a kind of growing area, but quite a new area. We have Eaton, who's arguing that the idea of hybrid human and AI writing is going to become normalized. So we're going to move to a space where it's absolutely fine, and that is just how everybody writes, that we interact with GenAI. It adds into our writing process. And we need to kind of reconsider this idea of authorship and think about kind of authorship in a different way. And this is quite interesting to me, because my background is as a medievalist. In the medieval period, there wasn't this kind of concept of this story is mine, I've written it, it's my thing. These stories were collective stories. People were able to take them, this is a kind of prose story, I'm going to rewrite it as a poem. No one's saying, oh my goodness, that's mine. Have you attributed me? Have you told me where all these ideas have come from? So they had a very, very different concept. So I'm not necessarily saying that's, exactly where we're going, but I think it's maybe interesting to think about, why do we have, such a tight control of authorship? I think there's lots of good things that come out of that, and it's good to trace the ideas, and as academics we want to give credit and we want to show where things have emerged from, but maybe there's some interesting things that we could take from different ideas of authorship. There's kind of research that's looking into whether AI, is a helper, as I think Tom and Johnny, your students, have maybe experienced it as scaffolding their learning. Or does it just kind of do the learning for them? And it's, obviously that's down to how students are using it. And we've also got some interesting things about how AI is really reshaping how we're thinking, how we're looking at things. And I think this is similar. We heard in our keynote yesterday, I was talking about the printing press, and that was a big technological revolution. And it did completely change how we functioned, because we didn't rely on memory so much. And, our brains have been completely reshaped by that process. So I think we don't quite know where we're going, but I think it is going to create a definite shift, a definite change. There's some interesting research around looking at people who have English as an additional language, who are then writing in English. And looking at linguistic identity and how AI can there's different approaches to the people they look at in the research about how they use AI. And it was really interesting because on one hand, it was kind of giving them confidence and they were producing written academic English that, looked more polished. But they also then had these kind of feelings that, but it's not quite me. So I've got this kind of dissonance between I've created this great thing, but actually it's not mine. So I'm not sure that I'm okay with that. And in a creative context, there's been some research published about AI as a collaborative partner and kind of running ideas off it. But that wasn't in the context, that was in the context of kind of creative ideas, but not so much the writing. So at the moment, there isn't anything about directly on GenAI and academic identity like we're looking at in this project. But, this is such a developing field that I didn't even check this today. So maybe there is now, but, it's a developing field, but I think this is an interesting aspect of the field. So I'm now going to turn over to Fran, who hopefully we can hear from online, and she's going to give some of her reflections.
Thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon, everyone in the room and live online. Can I just double check that you can hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you really great. Thanks, Fran.
Perfect. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Jessica, for having me. I appreciate that. As Jessica previously mentioned, I'm Fran. I'm a student in the PG Cert program, and just to reiterate that it has been rather a challenging time for our focus groups this time around, but I'm rather pleased to say that we have a couple of dates confirmed now moving forward. But for now, I hope I'm good enough to share a couple of reflections from my own experience as a student. So, look, I often think back to when I was first got a calculator at school, and I remember very clearly that from that moment on, I almost never did maths in my head again. Why would I? Because the calculator was quicker, more precise, and required much less effort. And looking back, I realized that something quite subtle shifted there. It wasn't that I suddenly stopped understanding maths, but the way I approached the task changed because the technology was doing part of the work for me. So I suppose we see that with loads of technologies in our everyday life. I have a dishwasher at home. I could wash everything by hand if I really wanted to, but the dishwasher makes life easier. So once that convenience is there, it becomes quite normal to rely on it. So when generative AI tools started appearing everywhere, I found myself in a bit of a dilemma. So on one hand, it was obvious how useful it could be. They can help with wording, structure, and sometimes just getting past that moment where you are literally staring at a blank page, really. But on the other hand, I was also wondering what this might mean for me, how I think, how I write, and particularly as a student on the PG Cert online distance learning program. Because in an online environment, writing becomes incredibly important. It's really where most of our thinking becomes visible. So our ideas tend to emerge through the things that we write in discussion posts, in assignments, in the online forums, or reflections like this one. So I started thinking carefully about how I actually wanted to use AI in my own work. And over time, I realized I had developed a kind of a personal sequence for using AI, which I'm sharing with you today as a simple 6-step framework. And yes, before anyone does ask, you're absolutely right to wonder, it was generated by AI. I simply gave you the prompt, quote, please generate a 6-step framework based on the following points. But the interesting thing is that the points themselves didn't come from AI. They emerged from how I had naturally started approaching my own writing. So I usually start with reading and try to develop my own understanding of the topic. Then I write my first draft independently, even if it's a bit rough and it doesn't look great, because I want the ideas to come from my own engagement with the material. And only after that, then I might use AI. And it's mostly for brainstorming or checking whether there are any angles that I might have missed. And later in the process, I can help with clarity, structure, proofreading. But by then, the argument, luckily, is already mine. Now, part of the reason why I'm quite intentional, and believe me, I'm not trying to come across as a negative Nelly when it comes to AI, I'm just a little bit protective, okay, of my own critical thinking, because I see writing as one of the main ways I work through ideas, and I don't really want to lose that process. And that's early research there that suggests that relying heavily on AI can lead people to outsource parts of their thinking, what some scholars describe as a cognitive offloading. And in much more extreme discussions, people even talk about the possibility of cognitive atrophy if we were to rely too much on technology. So whether that actually happens in the long run is still being debated, but it definitely made me reflect on my own habits. Now, at the same time, my experience with AI hasn't been entirely negative. When I use it later in the writing process, after I've already developed my ideas, it can actually help me refine my thinking. And sometimes it prompts questions or perspectives that push me to clarify an argument more carefully. And in that sense, it can support higher order thinking rather than replace it. But for me, to summarize my reflection here, is that it's a sequence, right? There is an understanding that comes in first, there's a writing second, and AI later. And that brings me to the last point. In my opinion, academic voice isn't just about writing nicely or sounding convincing. It's more about recognizing that those ideas in the text represent a way of seeing and interpreting the world, which is sometimes I refer to one of my favorite philosophers, René Descartes. He says, cogito ergo scribo, I think, therefore I write in English. So whenever we ask the question, whose voice is it anyway, like Jessica said, I think that we're really asking, where is the thinking behind the text? And for me, there is a balance that I'm trying to maintain as a student, using technology where it helps, but at the same time making sure that when I read my own work back, I can still recognize my own voice in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. So I'm just going to leave you with something that I found interesting. That there's a US academic called Michael Wagner or Wagner, I'm not sure how he pronounces his name. And he writes a blog about education and particularly about kind of issues to do with AI and technology. And he's very open about that he does this blog in conjunction with AI, and it really helps him writing. It does quite a lot of the writing process, a lot more than Fran was just describing. And he said that then he found another blog, and obviously they were using, the same AI, because he was like, wow, this sounds exactly like my blog. It's my voice. But he wasn't upset by this at all. He just said, I'm not bothered by this. I don't mind it. It's fine. And what I found really interesting is this final sentence that I've bolded. I care primarily about communicating ideas to others effectively and clearly. I am not a professional creative writer. So I find this quite naive, really, because I think there's no such thing as, I'm just communicating. I think we're always creating identity in writing. I think there's always unconscious things that the way we say things are saying about us, are saying about what we're communicating. So I don't think we can just say, well, I'm just communicating and that's it for me. These things don't really matter. Something that I found really interesting is Liz Jackson's recent article about the manliness of artificial intelligence. And she was saying that it's very interesting about ChatGPT, Microsoft Editor, Copilot. They all have this particular kind of tone of voice, and it's a very kind of Western masculine tone of voice. And that she was putting things in, and it was saying, no, be more clear, be more direct, be more concise. And she was like, well, actually, no, because it was taking out all kind of hedging language and things like that. And she was like, well, firstly, if I'm communicating with my academic team, I want to put things nicely. I don't just want to say, send me this, do this for me, that I need to relate to them as people. And also in her own academic writing, she was saying, it's really important as academics that we don't overclaim. So we need these things. We need to speak a bit more cautiously. So she said that, it's really putting across this particular method of communication. This is what we should all be doing. And the other thing that she kind of noted as well is that all these kind of generative AIs, they have what she calls the view from nowhere. They just kind of, make these great declarations, and they're not really showing, what's behind it. They're not really showing who the people are that are thinking these things. And actually, that's a really dangerous concept. So I thought her works, I really recommend reading the article. It's fascinating. So just to round off, the next steps are that we're actually going to do our focus groups, and hopefully we will come next year with some results. Fran's done a great job in getting some dates set up, so we'll have it. So I've got some kind of reflection questions for you to ponder, but we've also, I've not been very great at keeping myself to time, so we have just under 5 minutes for questions, either from people in the room or from people online. But thank you very much.